This podcast is presented by Castrol Edge Euro, the #1 brand recommended by technicians in Europe. Did you know that almost 50% of European vehicles in Canada come factory filled with Edge Euro? Offer better oil. Offer your customer Castrol Edge Euro. Questions? Contact your local auto parts distributor, or Wakefield Territory Sales Manager, or customer service at 1-800-268-5339. Welcome everyone to the podcast. It's your host Andrew Ross. Now, the obviously growing and evolving world of electric vehicles is one we keep an eye on, both at the new side, because what's coming on the intake side, what's coming in will eventually have to be fixed by our illustrious aftermarket professionals. But it is a really changing marketplace at that level. So to talk about that and the latest kind of consumer impressions of desirability of EVs is JD Nye. JD is the managing director for JD Power in Canada. He's been on the podcast before and is a friend of the podcast, friend of the pod. You've just released the latest research on what Canadians are thinking about EVs, and what did they have to say?
Yeah, a bunch of interesting findings this year. So we've been running this study since 2022. And I guess the top line result this year is that this is the first year since 2022 where we've seen EV consideration go up. And so just as a kind of maybe a bit of a background, this particular study is very much like a general population type of a survey. So we go out to members of the general public and ask them first, like, are you interested in buying a vehicle sometime in the next 24 months? They say yes. We ask them a bunch of questions, mostly in and around their intent to have an EV on their shopping list. And so if they say, yes, I'm interested in purchasing an EV, they kind of move down one survey track and answer a whole bunch of questions about, okay, well, which EV, which models are you interested in, all that kind of fun stuff. And then equally interesting is the group of people that say, no, I'm not interested in an EV. And then we ask them a whole slew of questions about, why aren't you interested? What are your reasons for, rejection or non-consideration? And then we kind of rack and stack all that info. And so this year we ended up with about 5,000 responses, give or take. So fairly robust study in this space by Canadian market research standards. And yes, we're excited to announce the results today, actually.
Yeah. So that EV consideration number, you said it went up, but where does it sit now?
Yeah, so it went up 6 percentage points year over year. So a fairly decent sized swing. So it sits now at 34%. And so in our parlance, that's what we might refer to as like net consideration or overall consideration. So that's the combination of our two answer buckets that are yes, I'm very likely to consider an EV, or somewhat likely to consider an EV. And so
talk about top two box responses being the
exactly, yeah. So in the past, that number was as low as kind of the high 20s, and so finally moving in a positive direction from a year over year perspective this year.
Right. Because as you say, this study started sort of after the first blush of EV kind of popularity and the rush to market for people who were like, oh, this is amazing. And you got that kind of early adopters. So this is really a more kind of consistent general population feeling at this stage. The pioneers have moved through the system, I think, at this stage.
Yeah, I mean, the EV market was interesting for its own sake during that very early adopter phase, but those buyers were always going to buy an EV almost regardless. And so it's somewhat less interesting to do work in that space. But by 2022, we were starting to get the early stages of what some researchers call the early majority. And so it's a very different buyer group. It's a buyer group that are interested in that EV technology, but are not evangelists about it.
Okay, that's a good way of putting it. Yeah, because there's certainly that, again, the early adopters, the people who were like looking for a vehicle that looked very different, as well as being an EV, so they could kind of signal in their lives that they were, I don't know, forward thinking or something, so,
Totally.
As opposed to wanting just an SUV that was, slightly more efficient or whatever the deal is. Right?
Yeah, that happened to be electric.
Happened to be electric, but still was very much like a conventional vehicle in every other respect, except for the drivetrain. What other interesting findings? So 34%. That's probably still more people. I mean, than what the market could supply anyway.
Yeah.
Every one of those walked in and said, "I want to buy one today." They probably have to wait a while, right? So
But that certainly was a challenge in the early days. I think a lot of manufacturers, or some of the legacy manufacturers have sorted out a lot of those issues. So I think you have a better chance of being able to buy one today than a couple of years ago, or getting one quickly than a
right,
couple of years ago. But
right,
yeah,
right.
it certainly was a kind of a drawback for a
Yeah,
little while.
yeah.
I guess that one of the other interesting findings this year was the kind of a bit of a reshuffling in terms of those reasons for non-consideration.
Okay.
For the entirety of our experience with the EVC study, affordability was always definitely in the top three, and usually kind of the top reason for EV non-consideration or EV rejection for pretty obvious reasons. In Canada, for a long time, these were rather expensive vehicles for a number of reasons that we can get into. But this year, affordability dropped out of the top three for the first time. Now
Really?
you can look at that as sort of like a glass half full or glass half empty, depending on your inclination there. But now the top three reasons for non-consideration are range anxiety, which has always been basically number one, either tied with affordability or number one by like a percentage point. Concern about public charging infrastructure, the availability, kind of amount of public charging stations, and this year cold weather and winter reliability or winter range concerns was the number three option. Like I said, with affordability dropping down, which is kind of I think it, sort of interesting finding based on what we see in the marketplace. There are a number of, frankly, just less expensive EVs available today, and have been made available, I'd say, over the last 6 to 8 months
Right.
in the Canadian market, and so that really has made a difference. I was answering a question the other day, just about which of the the structural challenges for EV adoption would be the most difficult for like an automaker or the government to address. Um, I think in Canada, obviously, the toughest one for the government or automakers would be, winter,
Yeah.
to address that particular problem. That would be a bit of a challenge.
Everybody complains about it. Nobody does anything about it. So
Automakers and manufacturers and oftentimes governments can be creative and solve a lot of problems. Solving winter in Canada, that might be a step too far. But that being said, if you were to ask me out of the 2025 study, which of these would be most difficult, I would have said I think affordability is going to be a really challenging problem to solve. And 1 year later, making enormous strides in terms of improving the affordability of EVs. So, it's a very fluid landscape at the moment.
right, right, and just for folks who are maybe in warmer climes or aren't kind of watching this very carefully, that for those folks who are doing some research into EVs, battery electric vehicles, obviously, hybrids notwithstanding, and plug-in hybrids notwithstanding, that issue of range in cold weather is really persistent, right? I mean, it's not like range anxiety. Oh, I don't know if I'll be able to go to the store or not, which is, you have 500 kilometers or whatever range on your vehicle, or 300 or whatever one. It's can I get home from we're based in Sudbury. Not aware of a vehicle on the market today at any reasonable kind of level of affordability that can get from Toronto to Sudbury in the winter without stopping.
Right.
I'm just not aware of one that can pull that range off when it's people joke, we sort of laugh about it because it is literally uphill the whole way.
Right. Yeah,
You
I
know,
mean, you might note that the Toronto to Sudbury commute is fairly rare,
it's rare,
but
100%, 100%. So yes, I do know the fine slices that we deal with here, right?
yeah,
How
you're
can
what
I
we might
get
refer to as a small you're a small sample size,
100%?
refers to it.
But it is also real in the sense that
Yeah,
for folks who do have longer drives at some point in their world and don't really have the option to have a second vehicle for those
right.
long drives. It keeps them out of that market, especially if they're, looking at that range that's going down to something around half. Once you get headwinds and cold weather and keeping the vehicle warm, so it's not just pretend anxiety. It's real, right? So, is I guess my point. One other really interesting component here, which is something that I mean, obviously Canada doesn't have an exclusive cornering of the market on cold weather. Shout out to anybody in Upper Peninsula, Michigan. They know what cold weather is all about. Um, but the issue of Chinese vehicles came up, which is definitely a largely Canada only consideration right now. What did the respondents have to say about Chinese EVs?
Yeah, we were lucky just in terms of the timing of when we had to get into field for this study that things were really percolating from a government perspective on the announcement with the government in China around allowing a quoted number of Chinese EVs into the country. And so we were able to kind of last minute wedge a couple of important questions into this year's study just to ask essentially that question. So, we know you're interested in shopping for an EV or at least having one on your shopping list. What about a Chinese OE, like a domestic brand OE? So just to be clear, with that question, we're not specific. We were not asking about your Tesla Model 3 built in China,
Right.
or the Polestar built in China, or like other global brands that just happen to be manufactured in China. In that case, we're talking about domestic Chinese OE brands. So for your listeners, brands that don't currently exist in Canada or not currently selling cars in
Right, right,
Canada.
like a BYD or a Geely or
It,
some of these others.
exactly. And so, yeah, so interestingly enough, of the people that said, yes, I'm kind of overall likely to consider an EV, about 56% of those people said that they would be open to considering a domestic Chinese brand OE.
That's
So
super
certainly,
interesting.
yeah, I mean, for any of the kind of legacy automakers out there, that the moment a brand new brand shows up and it's taking up space on the shopping list of your prospective customers, that's definitely a sizable threat.
Sure, sure. And for the aftermarket, it does spell a high likelihood that when these vehicles come in, assuming we're really talking about the ones that are going to come in at a more affordable level as part of that agreement. It's not a lot of
Yeah,
vehicles, but it's structured to grow, right? And so those are going to be on the roads, and for the aftermarket, they're going to need to be on point with when somebody shows up at that with that one of those vehicles at their independent shop. Because one of the concerns, as I look down here, that people do have over the entry of a new brand is parts and service, and so that's kind of the friction that's the drag on that popularity, right? Or that.
yeah. It was interesting the kind of the two sides of the consideration coin when it came to the domestic Chinese brands. That the on the positive side, um, those who are interested in looking at those brands seem like more or less pre-sold on the idea that they will be cheaper. They seem more or less pre-sold, and I think more importantly, pre-sold on the idea that the value proposition for those vehicles will be very strong. That the technology in the vehicles will be cutting edge, and that the battery technology will be fairly top notch. So that's um, that those that responded to our survey, they seem like have accepted all of those as being positives for these brands coming in. On the kind of the negative side, are some more kind of structural or longer term challenges. So definitely some commentary that we got around, we don't know the long term reliability of these vehicles. How will they stand up in a Canadian winter? And then to your point, there was quite a few comments around, how will these vehicles be supported from an after sales and parts availability perspective. So some concern there. So I guess if I was to sum up the attitude of our respondents around their likeliness to consider Chinese OE brands, it would be something like, okay, like you've got me interested, but and so I'm there, but now I have some more serious questions and some kind of some waiting for you to prove it items there too.
Right. Fair enough. And one of the things that occurs to me in looking at this, and there is some information on this divergence between the Canadian and U.S. marketplaces in the information and the studies that you've found, is just that. Obviously, the Chinese vehicle reality is something that we're having and going to have in Canada, and in all likelihood to a growing extent, not something that I don't think is on the horizon in the U.S. At present, and maybe not for a long time. Certainly, I'm not seeing any indications of that, and in fact, quite the contrary.
Yeah.
And also a divergence in, or a lag, maybe in that EV consideration between Canada and the U.S. I mean, in Canada, we talk about it being in kind of environmentalism and all that, but we're like quite a bit behind on the EV consideration than they are in the U.S.
Yeah.
Are you seeing this kind of divergence, Canada-U.S. market, in a lot of places between in this and kind of other places in the marketplace?
Yeah, I mean the US Canada comparisons are always interesting in a lot of our studies. We often joke that there's an exchange rate problem between Canadian survey respondents and US survey respondents. There does seem to be kind of a natural inclination for, like, if something is if a experience is pretty good in the US, an American customer, massive generalization here, so
Yeah.
I have a big asterisk across this, but are just more likely to mouse click on like an 8 out of 10, whereas a Canadian, if it's pretty good, will mouse click on a 7 out of 10. So that there does seem to be kind of a scoring exchange rate
We're hard markers,
challenge
man.
across the board. Yeah, oh,
We're
exactly,
generally
exactly.
unhappy.
Yeah,
It's actually
yeah.
really,
But it's cold. When it's cold, we're just a little cranky when the
yeah,
surveys come out. So,
the long
but
winters.
when it comes to, yeah, exactly. So when it comes to EVs, though, it is interesting to your point about, we like to view ourselves as slightly more virtuous or environmental than our US cousins. But when it comes to EV adoption or consideration, their consideration rates have always been much higher than they are in Canada. Kind of in the kind of mid 50% zone for that overall likely to consider in the US, although that's flat year over year. Whereas, and so for years, our two kind of numbers have been on a divergent trajectory, and now the US has kind of flattened off in that kind of mid 50s zone, whereas as the Canadian net consideration has risen. So this is the first time we've actually kind of closed that gap, or started to close that gap. But then, like, there are a number of kind of structural issues that I think drive that gap. Um, I mean, one is the state of California, which is essentially the size of Canada from an automotive market. They do still have, at least last I checked, they still have a fairly robust set of EV incentives on the books there, and so kind of a lot of dollars put behind EVs and their sale and lease. But then, too frankly, if I'm living in Southern California, um, a rear wheel drive only standard range battery EV kind of just makes sense for my 15, 20 mile, albeit hour and a half commute for that 15 or 20 miles, but it's just not that much range required, if that's kind of my exist, and it's always, optimal battery efficiency, 75-degree days, right?
Right,
So
right.
and so that means that customer can totally accept and easily kind of weave into their lives a lower cost EV. In Canada, we tend to prefer the longer range battery option, and we tend to prefer all-wheel drive vehicles, which automatically spikes the cost of EVs. So our kind of our baseline EV, at least from a desirability perspective in this country, is just it starts at a higher spot than what we see in the US.
Super interesting. Super interesting. Yeah. So there's certainly divergence, a little bit of thing, and there's good reasons for it. But I guess for me, what I take from it is that it's good kind of advice to not view the Canadian market as being some kind of percentage basis just of what's happening in the U.S. The marketplaces are quite different and diverging. We're going to have some different makers here too. So for aftermarket players looking at the future, really need to pay attention to kind of these smaller spaces that are going on. Now, there was one other thing in the survey that I thought was interesting was the bifurcation of the marketplace. We have all these folks who are saying, yeah, sure, I'll consider an EV, but there seems like a pretty staunch never EV group growing or being more entrenched. Am I reading that correctly?
So interestingly, that would have been true over the last couple of years. This year was where we actually saw that not at all likely to consider an EV. That's where almost all of that 6 percentage point swing came from. And so the group that was that, like, I'm never ever considering an EV, that number dropped by 6 percentage points year over year, where up until this year it had only been rising.
Oh wow, fantastic! So we've really seen.
Yeah.
So that's a. I mean, there's still a sizable contingent in that not considering at all component.
Oh yeah, yes. Sorry, yeah. Don't get me wrong. It's still the largest group. It's still 47% today, at least this year's study. So it's a significant percentage of the car buying public.
Those are converts. I mean,
but they
maybe
I don't think
it's hard to make that assumption. I know. I can see all your research statistical spidey senses going off when I say stuff like that.
No, I mean, they probably didn't all go to the yes, I'm definitely considering an EV, but they may have moved one slot further to the left on that chart, right? So that they're now like not likely to consider an EV, but we've certainly that was a fairly significant swing out of that kind of never ever group.
Right. But again, just to emphasize that never ever group is still a significant component of the marketplace. So if you're a shop or a distributor or jobber looking around your local regional marketplace and saying, well, I don't know why they're talking about EVs. There's nobody here driving them. We know it's not everywhere, right? I mean, but that can also change is, I guess, the other message too, right?
Well, and Canada's a big place. It's not a single market. It is very much a collection of regions, and local results may vary.
Right. That's a good point to end on. So take a look around, see how what we're talking about here, and there'll be a link in the show notes to some more information on the survey if you want to do the reading part. And look around your local marketplace, see what matches up, see what doesn't fit with what area, what other things you might be reading, and just kind of paying attention is the message, right? And what was true 2 years ago is definitely not true today, right?
Absolutely.
Okay. Thanks, JD. Thanks everyone for listening. Take care. Have a great day, and take care of each other, and all work out all right. Right. Cheers.
You're listening to the Great Canadian Aftermarket Podcast, brought to you by the publishers of Indie Garage and Jobber Nation. Connect with us online at indiegarage.ca and jobbernation.ca, a brand of Chat Integrated Media.